Good evening, sisters and brothers. So I've been working on this very deep question for y'all today. Who here votes that the Giants will win the World Series? All right, now that enthusiastic. Who here votes that the Detroit Tigers will win? I know there's one vote in here. Oh, they don't care. Well, I just want to give you a warm-up. I just want to give you a warm-up to prepare you for the following talk. By voting, didn't you feel like you were practicing the greatest freedom offered to you by this U.S. democracy? Would you like to vote on that statement? Since our childhood, we have been instilled with the moral principle that our ability to vote is the ultimate expression of our power and freedom in this country. We are allowed to vote on everything. It is your vote that will choose the next American Idol. It is or the winner of America's Got Talent. It's your vote that will pass resolution and propositions that will tax you a little or will tax you a lot. It is your vote that would also select politicians that will either stab you in the front or will stab you in the back. As Marxists and revolutionaries, we see through the deception that is the process of voting for our, quote, rights under bourgeois democracy, also known as the democracy of the 1%. Under this type of democracy, as Marx stated more than 100 years ago, quote, the oppressed are allowed once every few years to decide which particular representatives of the oppressing class are to represent and repress them, end quote. This begs the question, why can't we vote to end our oppression? Why can't we vote to end the power of management over workers? Why can't we vote to keep our jobs at our workplace? Why can't we vote to keep a factory or a school open? These questions, of course, make us dive deeper into the whole idea of what a democracy and representation really means. However, tonight we're not going to discuss what a workers' democracy after a socialist revolution would look like, but we will look at the assault against even this most basic political act, which is supposedly so sacred to this country. It was said by Emma Goldman, quote, if voting changed anything, it would be illegal, end quote. Yet, even if voting does not fundamentally change the gross inequality of this country, the ruling class is so fearful that it might lead to some glitch in their game that they are working hard to disenfranchise as many workers as possible in these upcoming elections, mainly under the guise of fighting voter fraud. This most recent attempt to address a supposed rampant practice of fraud during the elections is really a racist, covert attempt to target Black and Latino communities, particularly the elderly. Up to date, there has been no evidence that proves voter fraud is a problem. But the attack against these communities, largely Democratic Party voters, is an excuse to instill fears on those most affected by Republican politics. Yet, this recent attempt to prevent people from voting is just one example of a long history of worker marginalization under capitalist rule. The history of the United States is one of continuous struggle by disenfranchised people to achieve the right to vote. African Americans, Native Americans, and women were not allowed to vote when the original 13 colonies broke away from England. In the 1960s, civil rights workers were beaten and killed by racist thugs who often worked hand in hand with the police. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 extended the right to vote to include African Americans who had long been excluded from the electoral process. That right was achieved as a result of demonstrations, agitation, civil disobedience, not through the generosity of enlightened politicians. At first glance, it might seem that the history of voter inclusion in the United States has been a long march towards an ever-increasing rights of more and more groups who have been empowered and invited to participate on Election Day. That narrative, however, is profoundly misleading. In fact, these hard-fought rights have been repeatedly threatened. Although conservative groups describe voter fraud in race-neutral terms, their intent is clear. As the country grows more diverse and the historically white Republican base shrinks in relative terms, they are trying to disenfranchise Black, Latino, and other poor voters. This is especially urgent in the so-called swing states, where such groups can be of decisive importance. One of these states is Pennsylvania, where this just past August, a Pennsylvania judge upheld a controversial voter ID law that is meant to disqualify hundreds of thousands of voters. The measure requires voters to produce photo ID before they can cast ballots. This includes up-to-date state identification cards or passports. Analysis found that as many as 9% of voters had no such ID cards, and another 5% had expired cards. These groups were disproportionately poor, as well as newly eligible voters, the elderly, African Americans, and Latinos. Earlier this year, Pennsylvania House Majority Leader Mark Turzai predicted the voter ID law would help Mitt Romney win the state. A new analysis by CBS affiliate News 21 showed, as all nationwide reports show, that the rate of voter fraud is infinitesimal, and in-person voter impersonation on election day is virtually non-existent. Other, quote, battleground states where these types of racist and discriminatory laws are being promoted through legislative bodies are found in Ohio and Florida. This past month, the Secretary of State in Ohio had made a determination regarding early voting hours. What he determined was that there would be varying hours for early voting across the state. This meant that jurisdictions that tended to have majority white populations and where the majority of voters were registered Republican, their hours were going to be extended. This decision has since been pushed back, except for weekend voting, which still may have varying hours. And this, of course, impacts communities of color that tend to vote over the weekends. In Florida, the attack against voting rights has led to outright purging of thousands of voters. Those governing the state have waited until the last minute before the elections to deal with supposed issues and errors with the intention of creating confusion and intimidation of voters. An additional tactic by the state of Florida, which makes this an outright racist and discriminatory, is that they have asked the Department of Homeland Security to provide it with their database in order to verify citizenship. This is specifically targeting immigrant communities who already live under constant terror from authorities trying to find more methods for deporting our hardworking immigrant sisters and brothers, many of whom came to this country to flee US-backed reign of terror in Central and Latin America, and others who left Mexico when the impact of NAFTA destroyed the local agricultural industry. All in all, these laws could disenfranchise as many as 1 million voters. Nationwide, as many as 10 million eligible Latinos, especially recent naturalized immigrants, might lose the right to vote if such voter ID laws were to pass, according to a study conducted by the Advancement Project. Another example of voter disenfranchisement, which is one of the most insidious forms of voter discrimination, is that many of the state prisoners and ex-prisoners are not allowed to vote even after returning to their community. This ongoing denial of rights is particularly significant in the light of the huge increase in prison population over the last 40 years. The United States incarcerates more people, 2.2 million, more than any other country in the world. With all these examples, it is easy to see that Republicans, aware of their political base, that their political base is overwhelmingly white, have targeted people of color in their campaigns against so-called voter fraud. However, in spite of these overtly racist attacks, the Democratic Party, a party incapable of fighting for the needs of workers, has done little to defend the right to vote. As pointed out in the beginning of the talk, tonight's discussion will not go into depth on the examples of the promotion of voter participation in revolutionary socialist countries. But it is important to highlight the examples of Venezuela, who just recently experienced a historic election with over 81% of the population, and Cuba, who consistently celebrates over 96% voter participation. Unlike the US, the country that touts itself as being the greatest democracy on earth, in Venezuela, the National Electoral Council, or Consejo Nacional Electoral, worked diligently to register hundreds of thousands of voters and create thousands of new voting centers. Created after Chávez was elected for the first time in 1999, the CNE is an independent branch of the state whose work led to the participation of the most voters in Venezuelan history this past October 7th. The CNE has also achieved great success in registering young people and members of traditionally disenfranchised Afro-descendants and indigenous communities in remote and deprived regions of the country. Moreover, Venezuela passed an amnesty law in 2004 to naturalize its undocumented immigrant population, mostly Colombians and Ecuadorians, That's 10% of the population. That's comparison to what we have here. As a result, over 96% of the country's eligible citizens are now registered to vote, compared to, you have guess a number here in the US? Spit it out. 65 in the US. In Venezuela, elections, as many other Latin American countries, are held on Sundays in order to encourage greater participation, not smack middle of your work week. Perhaps most importantly, the CNE has established a transparent and sophisticated electronic voting system, which even the supposed progressive US president, Jimmy Carter, recently referred to as the best in the world. Touchscreen electronic voting machines produce paper receipts confirming the voter selection. These receipts are then placed in a sealed ballot box that can afterwards be counted in order to verify that the electronic results were accurate. This is extraordinary, considering that in the US, again, the most technologically advanced in the world, has yet to implement such user-friendly technology. Then, at the end of the election day, members of both opposition and pro-government parties carry out random audits of over 50% of the boxes carrying paper receipts, a much greater statistical sample that is needed to discount the possibility of fraud. In contrast, many voting systems in the US are difficult to audit, and in the 2000 presidential elections, the results were so disputed that they had to be determined by the US Supreme Court. So just these simple facts alone prove the silliness behind the propaganda against Chávez and Venezuela, who are constantly referred to as being under a dictatorship. If these facts were still true, and they proved that Venezuela is under dictatorship, we would have to come up with a new term to describe the system we live in the US. This type of slander by US imperialism against progressive and socialist countries is not uncommon. For example, a recent article in the Associated Press disgustingly portrayed the democratic elections in Cuba as a farce. Titled, quote, "Cuba's Elections, Grassroots Democracy or Sham?" End quote. Andrea Rodriguez claimed, using unprofessional and biased terminology, of course, that because Cuba didn't have a circus show surrounding the election campaign, it was not a true democracy. She stated, quote, "There are no flashy television ads or campaign signs spiked into front yards, and candidates definitely don't tour the island shaking hands and kissing babies. Sheets of paper with terse biographies and photos of the candidates were then taped up to strategically placed walls and windows in each neighborhood for residents to read. That's about the only campaigning that was allowed." End quote. For those of us who are revolted by the billions of dollars spent on the elections and a political circus show that does not address the real issues affecting our class, I think we would welcome this development. But it is an uphill battle to educate our class in the US about lies, and we all know that. We have plenty of evidence that dispels US propaganda, and we must use it. As our most recent eyewitness account, now an article online at Liberation News, states, in Cuba's municipal elections on Sunday, October 21st, more than 89% of eligible voters turned out to elect their delegates to the municipal assemblies of People's Power. Completely distinct from the US and other capitalist elections, the 32,183 candidates for the 14,537 posts in Cuba's 168 municipal assemblies were not nominated by moneyed interests or patronage, but by the people. As part of the civic duty, youth pioneers, the most conscious and active elements of Cuba's youth, monitored the voting booths and helped the elderly cast their votes. Unlike the US, where voting isn't permitted until 18, Cuban youth at the age of 16 are allowed to cast their first vote. It is a very important part of Cubans' participation in civil society. Another tool for education and our weapon against bourgeois elections is our Vote PSL 2012 campaign. Its supporters and members have not followed just the last week of our presidential campaign with our candidates Peter Lindsay and Yari Rosario. You should. As Chris' presentation showed, we're getting a lot of coverage. Peter and Yari have done a fantastic job at representing the views of our party and calling the elections what they are: a sham, a joke, and a gross lie to the suffering people in this country that want an end to the inequities and to oppression. As we approach the final leg of the elections, members throughout the country are packing their bags to visit workers in key states where our candidates are on the ballot. And our goal is to reach as many people as possible with our party's program. The maturity of the PSL's understanding of bourgeois elections lies in the fact that we know at the day after the elections are over, it will be a day that nothing has changed for millions of workers across the country, in which poverty remains the same, in which unemployment remains the same, in which homelessness remains the same. But so does the perspective and the goal of our party, that only with a movement, a mass workers' movement, fighting the multiple fronts of our capitalist oppression, fronts like sexism, racism, homophobia, and bigotry, and war, we will achieve real liberation, liberation that comes from socialism. And that is something we are not willing to compromise for any number of votes. Thank you.